The Mimic Deceased. Real name, Calvin Rankin. Occupation, student. Identity, secret. Legal status, American citizen with no criminal record. Other aliases, none. Place of birth, Passaic, New Jersey. Place of death, somewhere in Quebec Province, Canada. Known relatives, Ronald Rankin. Father, deceased. Group affiliation, former deputy leader of the X-Men. First appearance, X-Men number 19. Final appearance, Incredible Hulk number 161. History. Calvin Rankin was the son of biochemist Dr. Ronald Rankin, who was engaged in research of an unknown nature at the time that Calvin gained his power to mimic the abilities of others. Curious about his father's experiments, Calvin one day entered his father's laboratory while Dr. Rankin was out. Calvin accidentally knocked over a beaker containing an unknown chemical, causing a red gas to form, which he breathed in. Over the following months, Calvin discovered that he was as good at athletics as the best athletes at his high school, as long as he remained near them. Similarly, he found that he knew as much as any of his teachers did, as long as he was within the presence of that teacher. Calvin's pride in his new abilities evolved in time into arrogance and conceit. Finally, Dr. Rankin realized that his experimental chemical had given his son the ability to imitate the abilities of any person he was near. Believing that people would someday realize that his son had this superhuman ability and would attack Calvin from hatred and fear, Dr. Rankin took Calvin to an isolated cave where both of them lived for the following months. During that time, Dr. Rankin constructed a machine deep within the cave. Calvin could retain the abilities he mimicked from those of other people only as long as he remained within a certain distance of them. He believed, however, that his father's machine would enable him to retain any ability that he mimicked permanently. The machine drained so much current from the local power supply that one night it short-circuited every electrical fuse in the surrounding county. The two Rankins learned from a radio broadcast that a large number of people from a neighboring town were advancing towards the cave, having deduced that the cause of the blackout lay within. Fearing that these townspeople would turn into an angry mob and attack them, Dr. Rankin detonated explosives in order to seal off the entrance to the mine. However, Dr. Rankin underestimated the power of the explosives and was caught and killed in the blast. Calvin dug his way out of the mine hours later, but his father's machine lay in an area of the mine that had been sealed off by the cave-in that the explosion had caused. Calvin Rankin vowed on his father's grave that he would make humanity pay for his death by finding a way to use the machine and then making himself the most powerful man on earth. Sometime later, Rankin encountered Vera Ganter, a young librarian whom he had been trying to date, on her first date with Henry P. McCoy, who was then a member of the X-Men as the Beast, although his dual identity was at that time unknown to the public. Rankin accosted Ganter, and when McCoy tried to get him to leave her alone, he began fighting him. During the fight, Rankin gained not only the same degree of agility as the Beasts, but also developed the same powers as the Iceman, who was also present in his other identity. Nearby construction workers, believing Rankin to be a mutant, forced him to retreat. Rankin realized that he had just encountered the Beast and Iceman. Shortly thereafter, Rankin found himself sitting near Jean Grey in a cafeteria and found that he suddenly had developed telekinetic powers. He realized that she must be the X-Man then known as Marvel Girl, see Phoenix, and secretly followed her to the X-Men's base, the Westchester County mansion of Professor Charles Xavier. Rankin did not approach too closely to the mansion at first, for he began to develop telepathic powers like Xavier's and used them to determine the special composition of Cyclops' visor and glasses that enables him to block his eye beams. See Cyclops. Rankin rapidly constructed his own visor and glasses, and then went directly to the mansion and introduced himself to the X-Men, supposedly on friendly terms. But as soon as Rankin was certain that he had successfully mimicked their powers, he donned a costume he had brought, fought the X-Men, and kidnapped Marvel Girl. In costume, Rankin called himself the Mimic. The Mimic brought Marvel Girl to his cave hideout. Since he was now at a great distance from the other X-Men, he had lost all their powers except Marvel Girl's. His plan was to wait for the other X-Men to approach the cave, at which point he would regain their powers and use them to reach his father's machine, which was still sealed off from the rest of the cave. The Mimic's plan went as he intended. He used the I-beam power he had mimicked from Cyclops to blast his way to the machine, and had just turned it on when the X-Men broke in. The Mimic seized Xavier, who had accompanied the X-Men, as a hostage, and stood under the machine, expecting that it would make his mimicked powers permanent. Instead, the Mimic lost the mimicked powers and slumped unconscious. The X-Men, including Xavier and Marvel Girl, and bringing Rankin with them, escaped the cave just before the machine exploded due to a short circuit caused by Xavier. Xavier explained that the Mimic's father, realizing the trouble that his power of mimicry could cause, had actually designed the machine to remove that power. Xavier then psionically removed Calvin Rankin's memory of being the Mimic. Months later, while he was a student at Metro College in New York City, Rankin was caught in an explosion in a chemistry laboratory there. Rankin was uninjured, but the blast restored both his mimicry power and his memory of being the Mimic. Rankin then confronted the X-Men and, holding over them the threat of exposing their true identities, pressured them into accepting him as a member. Xavier agreed, since he knew the Mimic's powers would be useful against the menace of Factor 3. See Changeling. Moreover, since he knew that Rankin was too strong-willed to take orders from someone his own age, and since the X-Men's deputy leader, Cyclops, was at that time undergoing doubts about his own leadership ability, Xavier appointed the Mimic as temporary deputy leader. Almost immediately afterward, the Puppet Master, Puppet Master, seized control of the Mimic's mind, but the Angel released the Mimic from this mental control. The Mimic then proved to be of great assistance to the X-Men in battling the Factor 3 team of the Banshee and the Ogre. Banshee. It should be noted that the Mimic is the only member of the X-Men in its history who is not a mutant. Shortly afterwards, the Mimic's arrogance and combativeness led Xavier to dismiss him from the X-Men. Embittered, the Mimic decided to revenge himself on the X-Men and to use his powers against humanity. Before he left, he saw the Super Adaptoid, Super Adaptoid, defeat the X-Men, whom the Super Adaptoid intended to transform into androids with the power to mimic the abilities of others, as the Super Adaptoid itself could. The Mimic discovered that he could not mimic the abilities that the Super Adaptoid had itself mimicked, probably because the Super Adaptoid was a machine, not a living being. The Mimic then volunteered to have the Super Adaptoid transform him into an Adaptoid, and then join forces with the Super Adaptoid in conquering the world. The Super Adaptoid began the process of transforming the Mimic, but then Cyclops warned him that the Super Adaptoid would actually make the Mimic into his robot slave with no will of his own. The Mimic did not want to lose his free will and halted the transformation process. Enraged, the Super Adaptoid fought and finally caught the Mimic, who then used the telepathic power he had mimicked from Xavier to plant the idea of adapting the Mimic's own mimicked powers in the Super Adaptoid's mind. The Mimic guessed correctly that the Super Adaptoid would be unable to adapt the Mimic's imitated powers. When the Super Adaptoid tried to do so, an electrical backlash was created which caused both the Mimic and the Super Adaptoid to lose the powers they had mimicked from others, and which caused the Mimic even to lose his power to mimic others' abilities. The Super Adaptoid escaped, and Rankin, a better man for his experience, returned to normal life. But eventually, Rankin discovered that his mimicking powers kept returning and then disappearing again, each time becoming stronger and less controllable. Then, one time, the power returned at such a strong level that unless Rankin stayed on his guard constantly, he not only mimicked the abilities of others, but also, without intending to do so, drained all the energy from their bodies, leaving them dead. Rankin was panic-stricken, but Vera Ganter, with whom he was now having a romance, decided on a plan of action. Rankin secluded himself in a cabin in a large uninhabited wilderness in the province of Quebec in Canada, and she sought out Henry McCoy, who had by now gained a reputation as an expert on mutation and genetics, and brought him there. By now, Rankin had discovered that the amount of distance over which his powers functioned was increasing, and that eventually he might be draining energy from people all over the world without being able to stop himself from doing so. McCoy began work on an experiment to cure Rankin. However, the Hulk was at that time in Canada, and his power and life energy were being drained by the Mimic, who was unaware of the Hulk's presence. The Hulk headed in the direction that he sensed the power drain was coming from and found the Mimic's cavern. As the Beast, McCoy tried to hold the Hulk off, but then Rankin decided that the Hulk gave him the means of making certain of eliminating the menace that the Mimic posed to the world. Rankin held onto the Hulk long enough to drain a sufficient amount of the Hulk's gamma radiation into his body to kill him, and then died. Height, 6 feet 2 inches. Weight, 225 pounds. Eyes, brown. Hair, brown. Powers. The Mimic had the power to rearrange his own physical and genetic structure so as to give himself the same intellectual, psionic, or physical abilities as anyone whom he approached. The mimicking process was not subject to the Mimic's control and would take place whether or not he desired it. The Mimic had to approach within several feet of his subject in order to imitate his abilities. Thereafter, the Mimic had to remain within a certain unspecified distance of his subject, perhaps 1 mile, in order to retain those abilities. He would lose the abilities if he went beyond this limit, but if he then returned within the limit, he would regain them. While in the presence of the original X-Men, the Mimic possessed all of their superhuman powers. See Angel, Beast, Cyclops, Iceman, Phoenix, Professor X. Note, Marvel Girl possessed only limited telekinetic powers at that time. The Mimic also briefly possessed the same powers as the Banshee. See Banshee. The Mimic somehow added mass from an extra-dimensional source to himself in order to grow wings when he was in the vicinity of the Angel. Until his final months, the Mimic in no way adversely affected his subjects by the process of giving himself powers like theirs. The Mimic could not adapt the powers of non-humanoid beings or of non-living beings, nor could he adapt the powers of a being who had himself or herself gained these powers through a similar process.